Welcome to the wonderful world of worms. In my opinion, one of the most potent and important fishing baits that I use, and I'm sure the same applies for you. And there's a lot of rubbish talked about this particular bait, but it's a naturally occurring thing. They're not manufactured, it's not an artificial bait, it's a live thing. And I think that's why fish love them so much. So I just want to talk you through how I approach fishing with worms, the care of them, the preparation of them, and obviously the application during fishing. So let's blow away some of those curtains and show you behind the scenes in how we work with them. The most common and readily available worm is what is called the dendrobina, and that is the common sort of shop bought or commercially available product that most people can find here in the UK and in Northern Europe. And they seem to be very good and easy to use, and in my opinion very easy to keep. On top of that, another common worm that I actually love is the red worm. And now these aren't quite as easy to obtain, however they do occur naturally. These particular worms have come from a horse manure heap, and for some reason these are the caviar of worms in my opinion. They wriggle a lot. I presume they taste different to dendrobinas. They're obviously raised on a different medium. The food that they are living in, which is horse waste, seems to produce this kind of lively, small, tantalising, hard to resist red worm is what we call them. I'm sure they're called other things and I don't know the Latin for them, but I'm sure there is one. And gathering those is something you probably have to do yourself because they're not easy to get from the shop, but dendrobinas they are. Now these particular dendrobinas, and this is probably something that the question that everybody wants to know is, how do you keep them? Well, that bag of worms has been on my garage floor for 4 weeks, and all that I've done is nothing. I've left them on there. Now they're in the dark, but they're sealed up. They've been sealed with a tie wrap, and all I've done with those is once every sort of week I've just pushed a little dimple into the top of the bag while they've been on my garage floor and poured like a cup full of water onto the top just to keep the moisture. And I'm convinced it's the lack of interference with them that keeps them fresh, because ultimately if you keep checking them, turning them over, you're disturbing them, and they'll be happy to work, you know, and live in the medium that they're delivered in. Now I've heard people talk about feeding them, and you can do that. There is some worm food that you can buy from some of these worm suppliers that works. I know it works really well. Other people are using the tinned carrots and they're putting them in and letting them eat. Now me personally, I use quite a lot of worms, so not often do I have to keep my worms for a long period of time. However, if you do, then that's a couple of great tips for you to look after them. The red worms, on the other hand, which have been gathered, as I said, from some local stables with permission, down at the local horse place, I just keep them in an old pillowcase. Don't use the one off the bed because I don't think it'd be very popular at home, and I just leave that in a large amount of the manure that they came in, because the food that they are happy to feed on is that. It's basically the same thing that they live in, so they want to stay into that. And I just do the same thing. I just keep them in a dark sort of not dry place, but what I mean is that you can't leave them outside, because if they get wet too much, the soil will kind of get soggy and they'll die. But just make sure that they're on a nice concrete floor, which I find the best way to keep them. So that's the introduction to what this bait is. For me, as I said, a massive product that fish just can't resist, and really easy to fish with. And we're going to talk to you now about how we prepare them, and then we'll move on to how we fish with them as well. So obviously, as I've said, I think worms are massively important and probably one of the most effective baits that I've used, and they'll work all year round, but there are certain times of year when they seem to be more effective. Now I'm no fish scientist or a marine biologist by any stroke of the imagination, but basically I think that there's certain times of year when the meat, the protein and the high food content of worms is desirable by fish. And I think that's in springtime when they've come out of the wintering and they're starting to feed and they want to put some weight on and they get their appetite up. And then I also think it's then in the sort of late summer and early autumn when the fish know that sort of daylight hours are changing and they know they need to get some weight on prior to the winter. And I think it's important to kind of understand that about fishing, and that just goes for other baits and not just for worms, but with worms especially, with them being so potent and rich as a bait, there's a time when the fish gorge on them, and that's when they're at the most effective. And it's now early autumn this year, and we're going to put them to test here on Southfield Reservoir, which is a well-known sort of skimmer and bream water that's heavily fished, but yet it's still an effective bait, and that just goes to show you the power of worms. So we're going to fish here on a feeder and introduce worms, and worms only. I've not brought any other bait, just to kind of show you how effective they can be. And we'll start off by showing you how we clean them, how we chop them, and how we drain them off, and how we introduce them into us feed, and step by step we'll go through it for you. One of the most important things to do when you're preparing them is to make sure that they're clean, and that's the first and fundamental thing that I do when I get onto the bank. And there's a few ways of doing it, and depends how much time you've got. But if you're in a bit of a rush and a kerfuffle like I particularly was today, then a good way to do it is to wash them. Now you can use two things. One is a riddle, like a ground bait riddle, and just wash them into the water. Or if you're taking the shortcut like I have, use a nice fine hair mesh net, and I've just dropped them in and washed them in the edge of the lake, and that'll just rinse them off and removes most of the dirt. It's then important to put them into a sort of confined container and just leave them, because what will happen is the worms will bed down and they'll actually push any sort of excess bits that haven't gone through the riddle or the mesh like that, and they'll push that to the top, and just leave them be for a little while, and you can remove that at will, and they'll almost clean themselves off for the last 10% of the dirt, and you can see that forming already just while we're talking. So that's really important. Get them clean before you start, and then you're in control of what you're feeding into your peg. So although we're going to use a quantity of worms, I like to kind of keep control of how many I'm chopping. I'm sure you would too. And one of the ways that I do that is by keeping a sort of compact type of container. Most people use a sweet corn tin or a sort of small bait tub, but I just like this little plastic tub that I found in my garage, and that just helps me to control my chopping. I can keep on top of them, and just the right amount that'll do me for probably a third of the session, and that means that I can sort of not overuse my worms, because obviously they're not the cheapest thing in the world. However, I know we're going to use a few, so I'm going to chop this sort of quantity here, which is probably 250 grams, and I can keep also control of the fineness. Now today I'm actually going to chop them quite fine, because we could be fishing for a variety of sizes of fish, and these fish are no strangers to worms, and they're not strangers to bait either. It's a well-fished venue, so I'm trying to sort of give them more of a taste rather than fill up their bellies with great big chunks of worm, which will reduce, in my opinion, my chance of getting to pick my bait up that's on my hook, which obviously will be a worm also. So once I've chopped my worms, the first thing I do is drop them into this strainer. This is a nice little sort of strainer that fits into a 1 pint tub. I think this is a Cresta one. It's a cracking product. Tip them over. There's always an odd one at the bottom, and I just give that a little trim up with the scissors to make sure that everything's sort of the same size, because as I mentioned, I want control over my bait. But while we talk about control, the reason why I put them onto this sort of drainer, which is what it is, it's a sieve, but it's draining the worms into a tub underneath it, is that allows me to control the amount of moisture that I'm feeding through my ground bait. And worm juice is obviously a very potent thing to add to your ground bait as a attractant. However, it's also very wet, and ordinarily if I want to keep my ground bait to a moisture level, I'll use water. You can actually use, I mean, in a few moments there'll be some liquid in the bottom of that, which I'll show you, but it allows me to control the moisture of my ground bait. And then, for instance, on a deeper water, you don't want your ground bait too wet, because it'll probably come out your feeder. Or if you want to give it a good squeeze so it doesn't sort of break down as quick, then that control of the moisture levels is massively important. So you can use the water, the juice from it, to add to your ground bait if you so wish to change the moisture of it, but I like to make sure that I'm in control of that and it's not happening by accident. Very important part of feeder fishing for me. So we're going to settle into some fishing, and obviously I've showed you how I've prepped my worms, I've cleaned them off, and then obviously I've chopped them and put them into the sieve to drain, which obviously then leads us to how we introduce the bait through the feeder and in what quantities. And the first thing that, and I've already mentioned control, the first thing that I like to do is be in control of how many worms I'm putting through. And the best way for me to do that is to split off the bowl that I'm using for fishing out of and the bowl that I'm using for holding my main ground bait mix. And that's a really important tool for me, because it allows me to just have a smaller amount of bait off to one side that I'm constantly working with, and I'm not kind of chasing. So if I'm introducing sort of an amount of worms like that, a few fingerfuls of worms, and I'm putting them into this ground bait here, if I'm putting that into this small bowl which has got a limited amount of ground bait in it, I can control it. And no matter if I'm moving that around my bowl, it can't go anywhere, because the ratio of ground bait to worms I'm in control of. If I did the same thing and dropped that into me big holding bowl, as you want to call it, I push them around a little bit and they disappear. They go into the corners and they get buried underneath, and I just can't keep on top of it. So that's a really important thing for me. And even inside this smaller controlled bowl, I'll work in one corner, and that just allows me, and what I'm actually doing here is just moving ground bait through the amount of worms that I've put in, and I'm keeping them off to one side. So I've kind of got like my next 2 or 3 feederfuls on the go all the time. And as I said, control is the key to that, and that just allows you to increase and decrease the amount of bait you're introducing per feeder. I find that the best way to introduce this kind of really strong, important, caviar, if you like, which is chopped worm, because you have to know exactly what you're doing with it. Too much can be dangerous, too little ineffective. So control's a key. Well, the conditions are certainly perfect for the target species, which is skimmers and bream. It's an headwind, which, a lot of people say is the perfect conditions for breaming, and that's because the fish ordinarily would follow the wind. But I think that works well when it's a nice warm wind, which it's not a cold wind today, but it is the start of autumn. And the thing about this particular venue is it's very shallow, and the fish love the wind because it gives them a lot of cover. But if it's too choppy on a shallow venue, I don't think it particularly settles the fish. It unsettles them more. And on top of that, with it being so shallow, you get a lot of undertow on a big open venue like this. And any similar sort of reservoir or open lake, a wind creates undertow. Now, when it's in your face, you can't always detect that, because the undertow, it'll be pushing away from us. And I know for a fact, because I've fished this place quite a lot, is that when it's pushing away from you, it's not always good on a short line. So as much as I'm happy with the conditions and the wind, you kind of got to read that a little bit. And I think it's important to just sort of think about fishing that a little bit further. And when you're looking and thinking there's no tow, there will be tow, but it's because it's pushing away from us, you're not seeing it's a bend in your tip, which is great. But it's just understanding that, because if the wind was left to right or right to left, you'd find on a venue like this you'd have a massive amount of undertow, and you'd be getting that. And I actually think that makes the fish swim a bit more aggressively, because they have to sort of balance themselves against the tow, because it's flowing, it's a flowing water, it's moving. Whereas I think when it's stood still without tow, the fish are kind of a little bit more relaxed, and they can sort of swim around where they want at the leisure, and sometimes makes them hard to catch. So we can't really complain about the conditions, and I think that at some stage we'll get an influx of fish into a swim, and we'll start catching them. But we've had a few skimmers, and they're great fish, but I'd like to think that we could catch some sort of bigger fish, £1.5, £2, and even some of the bigger fish that that live in here, and they'll respond to them worms. And you know, back to obviously what we've focused on today, which is the bait being worms. The tow that we've just spoke about can make a massive difference and have a massive impact on how much bait, and how, especially when it comes to sort of worms, how much you can put in, because when it's towing, the fish are moving, they're feeding a little bit more. I find you can add a bit more bait and use it more of an attractant. But when it's stood and there's no tow, worms are very powerful. You can pull fish into your peg and there's basically too much choice, and the fish aren't sort of down chewing on the bottom, they're more picky, and they'll just bob down, grab a mouthful of bait and back up, obviously up in the water, which then means that you've got to be careful not to overfeed it. So what we're trying to do during this session is just push and pull the amount of bait that we're pushing through as feeder and get a reaction. And there's no set rules to that. Obviously I've just talked about, you know, my theories on conditions and what would make me think I could, you know, put a bit more bait in than other times. That were a strange bite, small fish, and I always like to try and push the boundaries and see how much bait I can get in, because I feel that if it's going to be a sort of a big weight job, you're going to need to attract quite a few fish, and that means they're going to eat a lot of the bait that's in your peg. The same goes for the smaller fish. If there are lots of smaller fish in your peg, they'll hoover up all that spare bait, which means that when you do get a visit from slightly better fish, I mean, that's another cracking skimmer, then you need something on the bottom ready for when that sort of arrival comes of your slightly better fish. So it's a bit of toe and heel, as I would say. I mean, these are stunning fish, but we'll just wait for the bigger specimens to come along. So yeah, it's a case of ensuring that you've got enough bait in your swim to maintain the amount of fish that are in there, but also retain enough bait after they've fed, like these small fish and the roach and the tiny skimmers. I'm just going to introduce a few more worms. So it's a balancing act, and you have to kind of read that, and you know, you might think, well, what's the formula? Trial and error is the formula. So as I said, we're going to push and pull, and I'm trying to push my limits on how many worms I'm putting in to make sure that I'm giving myself chance for that arrival after these pesky little critters that we're catching have had their fill. So we'll work through that and see how that pans out for us, because I still feel very confident that we're gonna have a great day on these fish here. Now obviously with a bait like worms, and considering that you might be putting in different amounts at different times of the day, then leads to feeder choice, because ultimately if you wanted to say feed some neat worms, you wouldn't be able to do that with a cage type feeder. But on my side tray, when I'm fishing this type of bait, I kind of have a selection, and that's differences in sizes, which depends on how much ground bait I want to put in, and then depending on the neatness of the worms and so the ratio, I'll also have different amounts of feed, different types of feeders to regulate that. And then on top of that, there's a difference between some of the feeders that are the same size and weight. For instance, I have a solid cage, a solid window and a cage window, and that's so that I can actually lock in my bait. So if you want a slow release, then you need to change your feeder. And what I mean by that is that if you want your feeder, your ground bait and your worms to stay inside your feeder for longer, then the best way for me is not just to change how I squeeze it, but to actually change the feeder that I'm putting it into. So that's really important. If I'm getting quick bites, I might be happy to use, let's say, a cage style rocket like that. But if I'm getting slow bites and I want to wait, I'll probably change up to a solid winder where I can lock my bait in and probably squeeze it down a bit harder, and that'll allow it to stay in my feeder. And for me, it gives more opportunity, more chance for the fish to pick up my hook bait, rather than feasting on the loose feed that's coming out my feeder. But ultimately, when I do hook that fish, it's leaving behind the bait that's coming out my feeder. So it's about ensuring it's still in your feeder when you've caught your fish. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you're usually feeding for your next fish, not for the one on that particular cast, because you're fishing off the bait from the cast before. So important to have a great selection of feeders. And then obviously, yes, depth and distance come into it. If you have to cast a long way, you're going to need a heavier feeder or a more aerodynamic feeder. But if you can cast, like today, we're only fishing sort of 30 metres or so, then you've got the luxury of deciding which feeder it is that you want to use to present the bait in either the way that you are trying to achieve or the way that the fish are responding. So just make sure you've got that covered. I find it really helpful just to have that change on my side tray, so I can make sure I can make the changes as and when I need, depending on what's happening in my peg. Well, I've just changed to a winder because I'd put in 2 really good rich feederfuls, because I felt that there weren't a lot of activity, and immediately I got signs off sort of nuisance fish. But then my tip were rattling, so I realised that obviously I'd attracted a lot of fish quite quickly with those 2 feederfuls. And then what I've actually done is just put in a winder feeder, which is a solid one, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of reduce the release of the bait. And immediately that's resulted in another one of them good sort of weight building skimmers. Cracking fish. So little tweaks, like I said earlier, about controlling the amount of bait that you put through can really have a massive impact on your catch rate, because ultimately not every day are you going to get a shoulder bream that are sort of climbing up your rod, and today's not particularly proving like one of those red letter days, but we're still getting fish, and there's still, inside of this day's fishing, you know, we've had an indication every single cast, but trying to pick out a way to sort of come back with a fish still needs calculating. And those changes, so I'm just getting that a good squeeze, changing up how you're presenting that bait can have massive effects and change your day, because throughout the course of a day, if you could sort of like set it up as it's called, i.e. a couple of sort of, I put cages in, they were just a 4 square sort of cage, a couple of them with really rich worms at the corner of the bowl, which is sort of really, I want to say probably 60% worms and 40% ground bait, a couple of those just to reinvigorate the peg. But then you've got to catch the fish that you've attracted, and doing that by just fishing like that. I mean, if you were fishing on a pole, you might put a ball of ground bait in with some worms in, and then you might fish over it for 15-20 minutes without feeding, and that's ultimately what we're doing with that. And that was a real sharp bite, so obviously that's kind of worked. We've had a response from it. So hook baits, obviously hook baits are worms, but over the years, you kind of, with different circumstances in fishing, different scenarios have led me to sort of build up a bit of a catalogue of different worm hook baits. And obviously the traditional dendrobina, which is comes in varying sizes, that's probably a big one. And you can get a nice small one, which all of a sudden is a different kind of bait in my mind. That if you compare two worms out the same bag, and one's a third of the size of the other. Now, I'll just run you through a few sort of different ways that I present worm hook baits. And with a lot of fishing, especially when it's smaller fish, I like to use a sort of wide gape, open point hook. This is actually a Tubertini Series 18. It's my go-to hook. That's a size 14. And when I want to fish for small fish, I'm inclined to use a small bait like that. And I hook it just like I would a maggot, because the way that I think small fish feed sometimes is that they're kind of sucking and blowing, and they're kind of spitting the bait out because it's difficult for them to chew a big bait. And that's why I like the sort of straight pointed hook. And what I don't want to do is fill that hook gape with my bait, so I just hook it like a maggot. If I'm catching really small fish and I want to sort of make my bait last a bit longer, and I'm catching multiple fish on the same one, I look at it little bit deeper and just thread it on a little bit. And what I might be inclined to do is sort of reduce the amount of worm that I actually use down to a small piece like so, which allows the smaller fish to swallow it. But by hooking it a little bit thicker, it means that I've still got all the point exposed, but basically I'm allowing enough skin of the worm to hold on to my hook so that I can use it on multiple fish, so I can catch in sort of match scenarios where I want to catch a little bit faster. Obviously, one of the most successful ways, especially for bream, is to have a big piece of dendrobina, and it can be great, but I often find that a full length dendrobina can lead to sort of wrap overs and not getting clean hook back, hook holds. So I like to take a full dendrobina, hook it on once, chop half of it. I've not done a very good job of measuring the halves, but sometimes I'll actually trim it back like so. So I've actually got, for all intents and purposes, a full worm on there, but it's in two halves, and that makes it a little bit shorter, which means the fish has not got to swallow as much length of the worm before my hook enters its mouth. That's a really effective bait. Or you can actually just fish a nice big piece, and I quite like the head of a worm to be hooked as opposed to a tail, and I think that's because I find the meat on the head a lot more durable. And if I want to fish a really big worm, what I'll do is I'll hook it through the head and probably just take off the bottom third or a quarter, and that'll allow me to fish a full dendrobina. Seldom do I do that. If I want to fish a lot of worm, then I'll probably put multiple pieces on. I also might be inclined to hair rig worm, where you just use like a quick stop and then I can thread it on, and in that scenario you can put 2 or 3 pieces on there. And then obviously you've got my favourite sort of worm hook bait, which is red worms, and they're cracking. Ordinarily, more than one seems to be the key, and the same goes with them. There's 2 ways that I hook those, either through the head, a little bit thicker than I would on a dendrobina, because the meat and the skin on them is not quite as tough. But what I always do is nip the very, very tip, and I mean you can hardly see what I've took off. I nip the tail of it off, and what that does for me, it stops the worm from folding up on itself, because one of the frustrating things about fishing red worms, especially when you've got 2 on, is the fact that if you leave them whole, they want to wriggle and curl, and they'll wind themselves up around the gape of the hook, and what you sometimes get is you'll get a bite, you'll hit the fish, it'll bump off, and you find that your red worm's gone over the point of the hook. So by just nipping off the tails, that works really well. The alternative to that is to nip off the heads before you hook them, and hook them then in the part that you've nipped off. So just take the very head off, and I mean literally a couple of mil, and just hook the top. So you've got, but you can see that that one's still trying to wind itself around the hook. Great example of what I'm talking about. But you're less inclined to have that problem if you, in fact, that's actually wriggled itself off, which is why I went for my normal approach, was hooking the head off and nipping the tail off. That's a very active bait, but trust me, even when you nip off the tails, you still get that wriggle. But either or, it's your own preference. And bunches of 1s, 2s, 3s. I've even seen people fishing 4 or 5 small ones, and depending on the size of the red worms, depends on how many I want to put on. So if they're really big, 2's ample. If they're really small, I might push to 3 or 4. Fantastic bait, multiple ways to hook it, scenarios, different sizes of fish. Small fish, obviously small pieces of worm. If you're hunting for bigger fish, multiples or bigger chunks are really effective. So that's the way I do it, and I'm sure you'll learn for yourself your own way. That feels like a better fish, and it's only been in 4.5 minutes, but the peg had just gone a little bit calmer, and I just sat with a piece of dendrobina on, about 1 inch long, and round it's gone, and it feels like a better skimmer. One of the sort of target fish that we're looking for, and you know, obviously we've attracted all them skimmers. There's been a lot of small fish, and I mean, one of the fish that loves worms, especially finely chopped worms, are the small fish. And one of the downsides to having such a bait that attracts all fish like worms do is that, used in the wrong context, you can actually attract the wrong species. But sure enough, and it might just be time of day and the length of time that we've been fishing, we have pulled in one of the better fish that inhabits this great water, and that is a cracking fish. Looks like quite a young fish as well, and you'll see that lump of dendrobina just hanging out the side of his mouth there, look, and I'm just going to drop that in there, show you that beauty. And that is a cracking, oh, good job we've kept his landing net there, look. That's a cracking wormfish, look at him. That's a young, healthy fish, and no doubt we'll probably catch a few more now, but hopefully talking you through how we've used worms effectively and walking you through the process of how we've attracted different stamps of fish through the day, and reading what's happening in the peg based on, you know, how many worms we've put in, attracting them small fish and trying to pull back by locking some bait in with a smaller feeder, using winders and using this ground bait accordingly. Then we've been able to manage a swim and work through that process. If you're going to take something away from this video and put it into your day's fishing and enjoy fishing with worms like I do, and hopefully have some great success. So thanks for joining us and thanks for tuning in, and I hope you obviously get pleasure from all our videos, and hopefully you learn a little bit along the way. So we'll see you again next time.